As Mykel pointed out, my name is Dustin Pendell. I'm fairly new to K-State, although I did go to school here way back in the day, so it's not completely new. We are going to do a joint talk like the previous one, and we're going to talk about opportunities, potential opportunities to save on cost of production. We'll start off with the livestock, and then we'll switch gears here in maybe 10 or 12 minutes, and Mike will talk about the crop side. Probably don't need to spend a lot of time on this to try to motivate this talk. About 2 weeks ago, the USDA Office of Chief Economist released their 10-year projections for the different commodities. I pulled out the beef specific, and I highlighted just your fed cattle and your feeder cattle prices. And if you start on your left here under the recent, you just kind of work your way to the right or fast forward across time. What do we see here more recently versus 2026? Not good is what I read the lips. The point I was trying to make here is, at least over the next 10 years, which a lot of things can change, I realize that, but they're not necessarily projecting prices to go up, to be higher than maybe what they are today. We're not going to get back into those 2014, early 2015 prices. Okay, so that's kind of the take-home message from this particular slide. Livestock Marketing Information Center out of Denver. They post kind of what they estimate cow-calf annual returns are. These are your returns over your cash costs, your variable costs. 2014 prices, returns, 15. We see what's happening in 16. What I wanted to point out here is that 2017, that one on the very far right. Again, it's not projecting in the short term to turn around. Okay. So now what we did is we dug into the KFMA, Kansas Farm Management Association's database, which Alan and Mykel talked about previously. Specifically, we're looking at the beef, cow, calf enterprise returns above variable costs. And we took those variable costs, so we took those returns and we broke them up by profit categories. We broke those operations up into thirds. So we took the profit, we ranked them 1 to 74, 72, and we broke them up into thirds. And we categorized those as your top third in terms of profit, your middle third, and your lower third. And so then we got some characteristics of those operations. We've got the price and the weight, gross income, and then we got all our expenses. And the question here on the slide, it says, what are the categories that separate the top third, this column right here, versus the bottom third, far right column? Well, is it your price? See if the price they received between those two. That's probably not it. Weight, about a 40-pound difference, but that's again, probably not driving a lot of this profitability. 37, almost 38% of this difference in gross income between your top third and your bottom third, or sorry, between your top third profit and your bottom third profit per cow is because of your gross income. So roughly, 38% of that gross income is, the difference in the gross income is because of income. So where's the other 62%? Well, it's coming from the cost side. And so that's what we're going to focus on the next 3 to 4 slides, is the cost aspects. So I pulled, you're looking at a chart here of that bottom portion of that table, the costs. This is for all 72 of those operations, kind of the average. Two things I really wanted to point out was this purple area, which is the feed costs, which is approximately 50%, 48%. So 48% of those total costs, of those variable costs, are feed. And then the second thing I want to point out is that little red, 21%. That's your pasture. So between your feed and your pasture expenses, it's about 70%, 68% of your total variable costs. Now, if we compare that top third group of producers to that bottom third in terms of profit, we looked at the differences. And this, it's about 60%, 55%, that purple area is due to the feed. So $133 per head difference between your top third and your bottom third producers is the result of feed. So what we want to do is we want to spend the next few minutes kind of honing in on that purple piece there. Earlier this year, a couple animal scientists at Iowa State released a short 2-3 page paper that talks about ways to reduce feed costs. And a couple things that popped out that to me that we're going to focus on is this extended grazing season. How we extend that grazing season as an opportunity to reduce those feed costs and minimize waste costs. We'll talk about hay. But there are a number of other suggestions here as well. Crop residue, first one. Talking about running your cows, suckers, maybe in some corn stalks. There are some advantages, some disadvantages. Some of your advantages, feed savings, as we just pointed out. Potentially could reduce some wear and tear if you put them here as opposed to maybe dry lot. Additional income. If by that we were thinking, if maybe you don't have any crop ground, this is an opportunity to maybe develop a strategic partnership relationship with a crop producer, where you could the crop producer could get some additional income. You could have access to some corn residue or crop residue. There are some disadvantages. Some people argue that you remove nutrients, organic matter, but again, that's going to be a function of how long you probably leave those cows on the stalks. Will require fencing if it does not have it. Possibly you might have to bring water as well. Lack of shelter, and then soil compaction. The soil compaction, you see this show up in the literature a lot. Although there was a recent study, 2015, that was done by Nebraska, Lincoln, that looked at this. They had a long-term study where I think it was 16 years, where they ran cows on crop residue, and then they followed up with corn and beans. And what they found over that 15 or 16-year study was there was no difference between yields where they ran livestock on the crop residue versus when they did not. So some of the studies suggest it, some don't. It's probably going to be a function of some other things as well. What's the soil? How long you leave those cows on that ground? How much rain, etc. Here's just some cost figures we were able to come across when renting out or leasing some of the crop residue. Here in Kansas, in the River Valley, Post Rock districts, crop residue range from anywhere from $3 to $25 an acre. Cover crops, we're going to talk about that next, but since it's here, we'll just mention it. $10 to $15 an acre is another what we found in the state of Kansas. Nebraska's got a survey they did in 2015, $10 to $15 an acre for crop residue. Iowa State earlier this year put out what they're forecasting for their cash rental rates, and they were looking anywhere from $8 to $19 an acre for the crop residue. Cover crops, which we just mentioned, is another possibility to kind of extend that grazing season. We are hearing of more and more producers that are doing this, planting cereal rye, radishes into some crops such as corn. Some advantages: it might improve soil and water quality. Helps with erosion control. It is like crop residue. It is a feed source, so it could potentially help reduce, minimize some of those feed costs. Disadvantages, as we saw before, if you don't have fence, water, that is another cost. Could increase your cost of, then you have to possibly purchase seed, plant, those cover crops, etc. If you've never done it before, you're going to have to learn a new crop. So some management, maybe possibly additional labor as well. And you might, depends on what the yields are for the cover crops, it might not make it, might not pay for it. We do on agmanager.info, we do have a decision tool for cover crops. Mykel, Robin, and is it Doug and Jamie Lynn are all part of that down here in the Southeast. And so there is a cover crop budget tool on our website. Actually, it's right here, I guess. In the interest of time, we're not going to spend a lot of time going through it. If you have questions, we can come back. But it is on Ag Manager's website, and you can see they've got various yields in your different categories. Winter wheat is maybe another option to extend that grazing season. We've heard people talk a lot about the dual purpose wheat, or you put your calves on maybe October, November, you run them through late January, early February, then you pull them off and you're still able to harvest a crop later. What we're hearing a lot more people talk about is a graze out, where they'll just put them on in October, November, and you run them through May, early June. So again, as Alan mentioned earlier, talking about the wheat prices and looking forward to next year, we're starting to hear more of discussion on maybe grazing out the wheat as opposed to the dual purpose. There are some decision tools for this as well, if you're interested in knowing more. OSU, Oklahoma State University, obviously they do a lot of this kind of grazing. They've got some nice electronic decision tools. We also have some information on both the grazing and the graze out on our Ag Manager website as well. So those were just some opportunities to extend the grazing season, maybe to try to minimize some of those feed costs. Another area of those top 10 ways to kind of reduce or minimize feed costs was minimize feed waste. And so we've got this slide here. There's two sources of waste lost. It can be either from storage or due to feeding. So storage, whether you store outside on the ground versus maybe storing it if you have access to storing it inside and ship. And so there's been a lot of research done at the various institutions, various universities, and they have found anywhere from about 5 to 40% hay can be lost due to storage issues. Feeding, a source of loss there could be either due to the bales or how you feed the hay. And obviously, this particular method, if you take a round bale and you put it out in a pasture, it tends to have the highest loss. I believe Colorado State University had a study that found there's up to 50% loss by kind of the method that you're seeing right here on the screen. Another way that would reduce that is you put a ring around it, right, a ring bale. And there are other various methods as well. If you take into account these two ways in which hay is lost, looking at the current price of hay, I think we average at about 65. I think we use $65. It can range anywhere from $12 to almost $60 per cow over the winter. And so if you go back maybe 5 slides, 6 slides, we had that one pie chart, right, that had the difference between your top end producers and the bottom third. The feed was $133 per head. So that's almost half right there by minimizing feed waste. And so these little things, although they seem minor, they definitely can add up in a hurry. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mykel to talk about crops. Which one do you need?
We have really good data from the state of Kansas via KFMA that allows us to see kind of what's going on in the state with cost of production, so that we have a pretty good sense of how much it costs you to do what you do and where the possible areas are for you to improve. So what this is 2015 corn enterprise data. So not looking at the rest of the farm, just looking at what it costs you to produce corn. And we broke it out by the highest profitability third, the mid third in terms of profitability, and the lowest third in terms of profitability. Okay, and so the first thing that I thought of when I looked at this was, okay, I'm going to go through here and I'm going to figure out what it takes to be a high profit producer, right? That seems like a worthwhile thing to do. So what are the categories that separate that top third from that bottom third? Because if you look down here at our numbers, you're going to go from making $61 an acre to losing $145. So you definitely want to be not in the bottom third, right? Okay, here's what doesn't appear to affect profitability, and that is price you received. The difference in the price received between my top third and my bottom third producers is all of about 9 cents a bushel. Okay, now I don't want to say that marketing doesn't matter, because it does, and paying attention to how you price your grain and having a strategy, those are all worthwhile things. But the price you receive does not differentiate you from the other producers. What differentiates you are the costs and how you manage those costs. Now, the fixed costs down here, the land charge, the depreciation, the operator labor, those are a little bit lower for our highest profit farms because they're also operating more acres. And so you can take those fixed costs and you can spread them over more acres, and that brings those costs down. But let's just look at the variable costs for a minute. And here's what I found kind of interesting, was that I've got much higher per acre costs on fertilizer and lime, seed, chemicals, and custom work. Okay? So why? Let's think about some of those, and let's think about some different ways we might be able to bring those costs down to get you into those highest profit areas. So we're going to talk a little bit about, you want to be efficient with your fertility. You want to try to have some strategies for pricing those inputs. Okay, field management and labor machinery management. So let's start with this. I'm going to say right off the bat, I'm not an agronomist. I don't know any agronomists. I've never dated an agronomist. Okay, I am not qualified to speak about agronomic things beyond what the K-State guys tell me I am permitted to speak about. Okay, so all of my information comes from our K-State agronomists, and when I go into their office, they sort of roll their eyes and say, okay, we'll try to help you understand. But this was something even an economist can understand, all right? It's a ladder, and it's a way of prioritizing your fertility management plan. Because when it comes right down to it, there's sort of an order in which things matter, and as long as you're taking care of those most important, those baseline things, the further you move up that ladder, the less impact those things have, and perhaps that's where we can cut some costs in the short run, okay? So let's talk for a minute about soil pH. It sort of underlies everything with regard to the efficacy of the rest of the stuff that you put on, okay? So the nutrient availability, all the fertilizer, all the phos, everything else that you put on is going to be affected by your soil pH. So you got to start with that. Let's just take a look at this real quick. The impact of liming really depends on where you start, where your pH starts at. If you start at a pretty low pH, like 4.6, and you put on an application let's say it's, $36 an acre, putting on lime, and we know that that's going to last for several years. Depends on your soils as to how many years it lasts, but that's apply it now, $36 an acre, but look at the yield bump that you get, okay? It's definitely worthwhile. Now, if you were at 5.1 and you want to bump it up to 5.9, you're not going to get as much bang for your buck. but you weren't starting at such a low point. Now, what I find interesting is the question of who pays for the lime? Who pays for the lime? You or the landowner? Both? Landlord? Both? Okay. It's an improvement to the soil that lasts for several years. So I completely understand why the landlord would need to be responsible for a portion of it, because let's say you're only renting that ground for 2 years at a time, but you've put on 10 years worth of lime, right? You don't want to be putting on that much lime and perhaps losing that lease, right? So that's a justification for the landlord doing it. But if that soil is at a pH of 4.6, just put on some damn lime, okay? Because the yield bump there is completely worth it. Here's another way of looking at it when it comes to phosphorus. So this chart takes us from up to 10 parts per million and then up to 20 parts per million, and this is what they call the building or the sufficiency recommendation. Okay, getting yourself up to that 20 parts per million, definitely worth it. That's a 50% increase in starter P to get you up to, that gets you up to a 95% yield bump. Now, is it worthwhile then to put on the next 10 parts per million to get a 5% yield bump? To be in that maintenance range. It's nice to be in that maintenance range, but do we need to be, especially right now? Let's get it up to sufficiency and call it good. And then we'll worry about getting above that and being in a maintenance area on a different year. By the way, if there's any input dealers in here, I'm sorry. What about nitrogen? Okay, how many folks soil test? All right, good. How many of you do the 6-inch soil test? How many of you do the 2-foot? Ooh. Okay, here's what I learned from the agronomist. Turns out that nitrogen leaches. And what? No, it doesn't? Not here? It gets down to the rock, doesn't it? All right, so how about the lime matters here, but nobody in Western Kansas gives a rat's butt. And here, apparently, you guys don't care about leaching nitrogen. All right, fine. Okay, there we go. All right, we're just skipping it. I will say, though, that just the ability to soil test, just the 6 inches, because the only 6 inches that you have, test that, okay? Be efficient. Don't be putting stuff on if you don't need it. All right, we have that sensor technology to be able to apply in a very efficient way, but you've got to have the underlying data to tell you where you need to be, okay? The point is that you get up into things like the secondary macro and micronutrients, and I'm pretty sure, because I've heard the sales pitches myself, you know, that there's these arguments for how that can be beneficial. When I speak to the agronomists about this, and I won't give their names so that they don't get any nasty phone calls, they basically say, what you're getting out of that is probably not worth it right now. So if there's going to be something that you skip, some of that extra stuff that's at the top of that ladder, you can skip it. Okay, how are we going to save on seed? I was speaking in the last 2 weeks, I've spoken to 2 different producers who had a seed buying strategy that they wanted to share with me. One of them, I don't know for sure, but I guess he's somewhere between 15 and 20,000 acres. He's out in northwest Kansas. The other one has 2 quarter sections in central Kansas, okay? So we got a pretty big difference in the size of these producers, right? But they both had a seed buying strategy that involved putting out a request for bids from their seed suppliers and saying, I will buy all of my corn seed from you. I will pay you cash, and I will buy it in November. Who can offer me the best price? And the interesting thing to me was I would have assumed that the guy out in northwest Kansas had been doing that all along. And yet he said the first time he did it was 2 years ago. That was the first time that he had said, hey, maybe I can ask for something a little bit better than what I've been getting. He told me that in the end, he got about an 18% discount on a seed. Now here's what's interesting about my Central Kansas producer though. He told me he got a 12% discount. So you don't have to be huge. The bigger you are, the more purchasing power you have, the ability to probably negotiate that even better. So what happens if you're not very big? I bet you know somebody next door who probably grows the same thing you do, right? And like he looks to me like a very honest gentleman who's not paying attention. Hey, right here. Yeah. So you could say to him, hey, how about you and I go in on this together? And I'll give you my money and you will negotiate the deal, right? That's illegal. It is not. Is it illegal? It's illegal? You can't buy your seed for somebody else? Moving on. I need to spray. I think I'm going to spray tomorrow. Should I be driving into town today to buy the chemicals from the co-op? You need to be thinking 6 to 9 months out. Always 6 to 9 months out. You should not be thinking about tomorrow. Well, I mean, think a little, but not too much. When it comes to your management, 6 to 9 months out. Okay? Then I'm showing these cost categories to the agronomist, and he's looking at how much money is being spent on spraying, and he's like, well, their problem is that they're not getting into the field when they need to in order to spray it when the weeds are this high. They're going in when the weeds are this high. He's like, so they've got to just work harder at scouting their fields and being out when they need to. And I was like, yeah. And then I got back to my office and I started thinking, who would intentionally not spray their weeds when they needed to? So help me through this. If you're not spraying your weeds, it's because you're not getting out there before they get too high. What keeps you from getting out there when you need to? Mud. What? Let's call it weather. Right? But we all face the same weather here. So what separates us beyond weather? What'd you say? Well, yeah, there's definitely a management aspect to this, right? How much effort you're putting into it. But what are some other things? Okay. Remember how I said one of the other categories that was rather high was the custom hire? It's higher for my lowest profit farms. If you're waiting on somebody to come out and spray for you, if you are not the first one in line, you could end up with them coming out later than you want them to, and you're not knocking down those weeds as efficiently as you'd like to. But what if you own your own equipment? Anybody in here have a part-time job working in town? Nobody? You're all full-time producers. Every one of you. Okay. And you all run your own equipment. You don't let your wife ever run the sprayer, right? Absolutely not. Okay, well, you guys are killing me. Some folks have part-time jobs in town, right? Or even full-time jobs in town. And they're trying to manage that as well as farming. And so the challenge to say, okay, given my weather conditions and the fact that I work from 8 to 5, do you always get into the field in the most timely manner possible? Okay? So when the bank says to you, you need to go find a part-time job, first you say, how about what job, right? What job in town? Because I'm not making a lot of money selling John Deere equipment on commission. And number two, how does that affect your bottom line and your ability to be a very, very effective manager? We've got 5 minutes left. Do you have any questions before we break? Oh, yes, sir.
On the cow side of this, would it be a good idea to invest in, say, a grinder in order to, I mean, would it be worth it cutting down the loss, like say on the hay, because if you're putting some grinder, you're losing half of your hay, would the cost that you save from not losing that 50%, would that justify purchase of a grinder?
Okay, so the question is, by cutting down on feed waste from it being on the ground and getting trampled and everything, can you justify a grinder?
Yes.
Okay, how are you going to answer that question?
I guess it would depend on how much you plan on spending on the grinder.
Okay, that's a good starting point. How much does that grinder cost?
Quite a bit.
Quite a bit. Okay, 25 grand? And how many years are you going to use? But aren't you a pretty good mechanic?
We have one on the second.
Yeah, you have a good mechanic on staff? Good. Okay. Whenever you look at that kind of an option, and then do you know how much feed you're losing? Do you have any sense of that? Because the trade-off is the extra cost of that grinder relative to the lost feed. So you really need to essentially start observing really closely how much feed you're personally losing given where you feed and how you rotate it around. Figure out what that feed is worth to you, and then compare that to what you're going to incur for costs on that grinder. That's how you approach that.
It's about a trade-off.
It's about a break even for you? Okay. So the other thing to think about is how does it change your labor usage?
Your labor, it changes the quality of feed
Okay.
and all those things, which in the end is benefits.
Okay. So it sounds to me like you didn't need me to answer that question. I don't even know why I come here. You're a tough audience, and you always like to remind me that you have no soil, therefore nitrogen doesn't matter. I'm not going to forget that, by the way. Okay, any other questions? Why don't we take a break, and we'll be back here in, is it 15 minutes? Yeah, thank you.